The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Nurse Hartley was already halfway to her car. She had her badge in one hand and her keys in the other, and she wasn't going back. She had decided that much during the last 20 minutes of her shift, standing in the hallway outside room 14 while Dr. Pemberton told her in the flat, administrative tone she had come to recognize as the voice of someone who had already made up their mind that her services at Ridgecrest Regional would no longer be required. Effective immediately. They would mail her final check. 12 years. That's how long Abigail Hartley had worked that floor. 12 years of double shifts in January when half the staff called in sick. 12 years of staying past 7 because the oncoming nurse hadn't shown yet. 12 years of knowing every patient's name before she looked at the chart. And it ended in a hallway conversation that lasted 4 minutes. She pushed through the side exit and the cold hit her. Northern Ontario in November had a particular kind of cold. Not the dry snap of the prairies, but something heavier, like the air itself was pressing down. She stood under the parking lot lights and just breathed for a moment. The gravel was wet. Somewhere across the lot an engine idled. She had known it was coming. That was the worst part. She had known since August. Since the meeting where she had put the discrepancy report on the table, 43 pages printed and bound, with a cover sheet and her contact information at the top, and watched Director Vance glance at it, set it aside, and change the subject. She had known when her shift rotations started shifting. When she was pulled from the cardiac ward without explanation and reassigned to administrative filing. When her locker had been moved to the end of the row, near the emergency exit. As if they were already making room. She had documented all of it. That was her nature. Her mother used to say Abigail came out of the womb with a notepad, and it wasn't entirely wrong. She wrote things down. She kept copies. She had a filing system on her home computer that her younger brother called aggressively organized, and that she called functional. She was almost to her car when she heard footsteps behind her. Not running. Deliberate, military. She turned. There were 2 of them, both in civilian clothes. Dark jackets, no insignia, but she could read the posture the same way she could read a patient's color before the monitor confirmed what she already knew. These were not men who were lost. These were not men who needed directions to the visitor entrance. The taller one stopped a few feet away. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, but his eyes were steady and serious, and he was looking at her like she was exactly the person he had come to find. Nurse Hartley, he said. Not a question. She didn't answer right away. 12 years of triage had taught her that the first few seconds of any situation told you more than the next 20 minutes of conversation. Who's asking? She said. He reached into his jacket and produced an ID, Federal. She didn't recognize the specific division, but she recognized the letterhead and the security clearance indicator along the bottom edge. She had seen those once before, years ago, when a patient had come in off a transport and 3 men in the hallway had made clear, without saying anything at all, that certain things about his admission were not going to be discussed. My name is Warren Carver, he said. This is Specialist Dunn. We'd like a few minutes of your time. I just got fired, she said. I don't work here anymore. We know, he said. That's actually why we're here. She sat in the back of their vehicle, a dark gray SUV with Federal plates that had been parked 2 rows behind her own car, which she now realized had not been an accident, and listened while Carver explained, in the measured and precise way of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, but not too many times, that her report had not gone unnoticed. Not by Vance, not by the board, but by someone else. The discrepancy report she had filed in August, the one that had been set aside, that had cost her the cardiac ward, that had cost her 12 years of work on a Tuesday night in a parking lot, had been intercepted at a federal level, not illegally, through a process she didn't fully understand involving provincial oversight mechanisms and a procurement audit that had been running quietly for 7 months. A different investigation, running on a parallel track, had crossed paths with her documentation twice. You flagged the supply contracts, Carver said. I flagged irregularities in the supply contracts, she said. Billing discrepancies. Equipment that was logged as delivered that I never saw delivered. Medications listed as administered that weren't in the patient records. 43 pages of it. You kept copies. Of course I kept copies. Carver and Dunn exchanged a look that was brief and professional, and told her absolutely nothing except that they had expected that answer. Nurse Hartley, Carver said, the irregularities you documented are consistent with a pattern we've been tracking across 6 facilities in 3 provinces. The contracts route through a numbered company that sits inside a procurement structure that has been, until recently, very difficult to trace. She looked at him. The parking lot lights were still visible through the rear window. She could see the side exit she had walked through 20 minutes ago. Until recently, she repeated. Your report identified a signature authorization we hadn't been able to place, he said. It appears on purchasing approvals at 3 of the 6 facilities. We had the name but no documentation linking it to actual transactions. You gave us the transactions. She thought about the 43 pages. She thought about the Tuesday afternoons she had spent in the records room, going through binders, cross-referencing dates, making notes in the margins of a spiral notebook she kept in her bag. She thought about the moment she had realized the pattern was not accidental, not clerical error, not administrative inefficiency, but something deliberate and sustained and expensive. She had felt sick that day. Then she had kept writing. What do you need from me? She said. What they needed was not simple, and it was not quick. Over the following 2 weeks, Abigail drove to a government building in Sudbury 4 times. The building had no identifying signage. The parking was underground. The room they used was a mid-sized conference space with fluorescent lighting and a whiteboard that someone always erased before she arrived. And each time she sat down across from a shifting configuration of people. Carver was always there, Dunn was usually there, and the others rotated in and out. She brought what she had. She brought the copies she had made. The originals she had photographed. The spiral notebook. A second notebook she had started in September when she realized the first one was getting full. USB drives she had been keeping in a fireproof box under her bed since October, a precaution her brother had called paranoid and that she had called practical. The lead investigator on the federal side was a woman named Superintendent Okafor. Not Brenda Okafor. This was a different woman entirely. A compact and precise person who spoke very carefully and who had the specific kind of patience that came from spending years working cases that moved in inches. She went through Abigail's documentation with the attention of someone who was used to finding things other people had missed, and several times she paused and asked a question that made Abigail understand that what she had thought was a minor detail had turned out to be significant. The equipment logs, Superintendent Okafor said during the 3rd session. You noted the delivery dates. I noted the discrepancy between the log delivery dates and the actual requisition paperwork, Abigail said. The deliveries were logged as confirmed before the requisitions were filed, which is physically impossible. You caught that. I had to recheck it twice because I thought I'd misread the dates, Abigail said. I hadn't. Superintendent Okafor wrote something down. She had that in common with Abigail. She wrote everything by hand first, typed it up later. Abigail had noticed that during the first session and felt, for the first time since the parking lot, something close to calm. She had not been sleeping well. That was honest. She was staying at her brother's place in Sudbury. She had sublet her apartment in Ridgecrest before any of this started, a coincidence of timing that now felt providential. And she was waking up at 3 in the morning with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had decided that sleep was a risk she could no longer afford. She made tea. She sat at her brother's kitchen table and went through her notes again, not because she needed to, but because moving through them helped her think. The name that appeared on the authorization signatures was Hollister. She hadn't known who that was when she filed the report. She knew more now. Director Hollister had been the Regional Procurement Administrator for the Northern Ontario Health Authority for 11 years. He was, by all visible accounts, a thorough and capable administrator. He attended conferences. He had written 2 papers on supply chain efficiency that had been cited in trade publications. He had a reputation for being, in the particular phrase that kept appearing when Abigail researched him, detail-oriented. His signature appeared on purchasing approvals for medical equipment and pharmaceutical supply contracts across 7 facilities. At 3 of those facilities, the contracts had gone to companies that did not appear to exist in any provincial business registry until shortly before the contracts were awarded, and that ceased to appear in any registry within 18 months of the contract completion. 43 pages had been enough to name the pattern. 2 notebooks and 7 weeks of federal investigation had been enough to name the person. She was in the kitchen at her brother's house on a Thursday morning when Carver called. "We've executed the warrants," he said. She sat down. She had been standing at the counter with a cup of tea, and she sat down because her legs made the decision before her brain caught up. All of them? All 3 locations simultaneously, this morning at 6. Hollister was taken into custody at his residence at 6:14. His office is sealed. The board has been notified, and the chair has formally suspended the procurement division pending review. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Nurse Hartley," Carver said. "You still there?" "I'm here," she said. "There will be a formal process," he said. "You'll be contacted by the provincial ombudsman's office regarding your status at Ridgecrest. I can't make any promises about timelines, but the documentation you provided will be part of the official record, and your role in the investigation will be accurately represented." She thought about Dr. Pemberton in the hallway, the flat tone, the 4 minutes. She thought about the filing room she had been reassigned to, and the afternoons she had spent there going through binders, and the way that no one had seemed to notice that she was still doing her job, just a different one than the one they thought they were punishing her with. "Okay," she said. "There's something else," Carver said. He paused in a way that was different from his usual pauses, less procedural. "Superintendent Okafor asked me to relay something." "All right." She said, and I'm quoting, "Tell Nurse Hartley that the reason this case broke when it did, and not 2 years from now, is because she wrote down the dates." Abigail looked out the window. Her brother's backyard in November. The trees stripped down, the sky low and white, clean. "Tell her I had a good system," she said. The formal review took 4 months. Abigail didn't go back to Ridgecrest in that time. She took a locum position at a smaller facility in Espanola, an hour west, and she worked the evening shift, and she didn't talk about what had happened except to say that she had been between positions. The staff there were short-handed and efficient, and no one asked many questions, which suited her. She did her work. She learned the rhythms of a different floor. She kept her notebooks, because that was who she was, and that was not going to change. In February, she received a formal letter from the Provincial Health Authority. It ran to 6 pages. The relevant sentence was in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page. "The termination of employment of registered nurse Abigail Hartley, effective November 14th, is hereby rescinded in full, with all accrued seniority and benefits reinstated, and the record of termination expunged from her employment file." She read it twice. Then she called her brother. "They rescinded it," she said. "All of it?" "All of it. Seniority, benefits, clean record." He was quiet for a moment. Her brother was not a quiet person as a rule, but he had certain silences that were specific and that she had learned to read. This one was the silence of someone trying not to say "I told you so," while also being genuinely relieved. "Are you going back?" he asked. She thought about it. She had been thinking about it since October, really, since the moment she had sat in the records room with a binder across her lap and understood that the problem she was looking at was too large for one person to fix quietly, and that she was going to have to decide what kind of person she was. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true. She went back in March. Not because she had to. She had other options by that point. Superintendent Okafor had mentioned, in the careful and indirect way of someone making a suggestion that was not quite an offer, that there were provincial oversight bodies that valued people who knew how to read a discrepancy, and had the particular combination of patience and stubbornness required to document one. Abigail had thanked her and said she would think about it. She thought about it. She thought about the cardiac ward and the patients whose names she had known before she looked at the charts. She thought about what it meant to be good at something and to do it in the place where it was needed most. She went back in March. The first morning, She parked in the same lot. The gravel was still wet. There had been rain the night before. She sat in her car for a moment, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted to notice it. The ordinary quality of it. The same lights, the same side exit, the same air. Then she got out, put on her badge, and went to work. Dr. Pemberton passed her in the hallway near room 14. He stopped. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. And then he said, quietly, "Nurse Hartley." She looked at him. She had prepared nothing for this moment, and she found she didn't need to. "Dr. Pemberton," she said. And she walked on. At the nursing station, one of the junior staff, a second year named Chadwick, who had been on the floor about 8 months, handed her the morning chart rundown without ceremony and said, "Bed 6 is tricky, came in overnight, the intake notes are a bit thin." "All right," she said. She took the chart. She read through it the way she always read, carefully and completely, and she noted 2 things that the overnight nurse had missed, and 1 thing that would need to be flagged with the attending before 9. She wrote it down. The floor was the same floor it had always been. The work was the same work. Outside, the northern Ontario sky was doing what it did in March, gray and reluctant, not quite winter and not quite spring, promising nothing and delivering whatever it wanted. She had her notebook. She had her system. She had 12 years of knowing what to look for and the particular kind of stubbornness that had always looked, to the people who found it inconvenient, a great deal like a problem. She had learned to consider that a compliment. I keep thinking about the spiral notebook. Not the federal warrants, not the 6-page letter that arrived in February, not even the moment Carver called to say Hollister was in custody. What stays with me is the image of Abigail Hartley sitting in a records room on a Tuesday afternoon, a binder open across her lap, writing down dates that didn't add up. Not because anyone asked her to, not because she thought it would lead anywhere in particular, but because that was simply who she was. There's a cause and effect to how her story unfolded, that I find myself returning to again and again. The board thought they were punishing her when they moved her to administrative filing. They put her in a room full of records and gave her time she hadn't had before. She used it. Every consequence they intended as a humiliation became, in her hands, a resource. That's not luck. That's what happens when someone's integrity is so ingrained that even the people trying to contain it end up handing it more material to work with. What strikes me about Abigail isn't the dramatic part. The federal agents in the parking lot. The SUV with no plates. The conference room in Sudbury. What strikes me is the 8 months before any of that. The ordinary, unglamorous, largely invisible work of noticing something wrong and deciding it was worth writing down. Most people notice. Fewer people write it down. Fewer still keep a second notebook when the first one fills up, and a fireproof box under the bed, and copies made at every stage, not out of fear, but out of a deep and practiced understanding that truth has to be maintained the same way a patient has to be monitored. Consistently, carefully, without gaps. That's what I'd call real intelligence. Not cleverness, not credentials, but the discipline to observe accurately and record honestly, even when no one is watching and nothing seems to be happening as a result. And then there's what she did with the weight of it. Because it did have weight. She wasn't sleeping. She was staying at her brother's place, waking up at 3 in the morning, making tea in the dark. She kept going anyway, not through some dramatic act of willpower, but through the quieter, more sustainable version of it. Showing up to the next session in Sudbury, bringing the next book, answering the next question from Superintendent Okafor with the same clarity she'd brought to the first one. That kind of endurance doesn't make headlines. It's the kind that actually changes things. What I take from Abigail's story is something I've had to learn more than once in my own life. The right thing and the rewarded thing are not always the same thing at the same time. She did the right thing in August. She didn't get rewarded until March. In between, she lost her job, her floor, 12 years of seniority, all of it, at least temporarily. She kept going anyway, not because she knew how it would end, but because she couldn't see any version of herself that didn't. That's the only kind of integrity that means anything, I think. Not the kind that holds when it's easy, the kind that holds when it costs something. She walked back into Ridgecrest on a wet morning in March with her badge and her notebook, and nothing to prove to anyone. She passed Dr. Pemberton in the hallway and said his name and kept walking. I think about that a lot.